Welcome to Focus on Why, the podcast where reflection sparks action. I'm Amy Rowlandson, and together we'll explore compelling stories, profound insights, and transformative experiences from inspiring guests worldwide. Feeling lost or unfulfilled? Searching for clarity, purpose, or meaning in your work and life? This podcast invites you on a journey of self-discovery to align your work with your values, shape your future with intention, and create a purposeful way of life. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why. Before we dive in, let me share how I can transform your journey as a purpose coach. I specialise in helping you get crystal clear on your why, aligning your passion with your purpose, and crafting a plan to create the life you truly desire. Book a free 30-minute coaching call today. The link is in the show notes. Let's start building your purposeful future together. Today on Focus on Why, I am joined by Jazz Singh. Jazz, welcome.
Thank you very much, Amy, for having me. It's lovely to be here.
And a shout out to our friend Matt Horder, who made the introduction. So thanks, Matt.
Yep, beautiful god brother.
Oh, I love that. So tell me, Jazz, what is it you're focusing on right now?
Well, I'm working on social justice and in the criminal justice space. And I'm trying to bring down barriers, both in people's minds about what talent looks like when it comes from prison, what hidden gems are in that, what I call the rubies in the rubble from the prison estate. But equally is to look at systemic change in society so that we are much more inclusive, but also we have what I call global voices to local issues.
Okay, where do I start? There are so many things there. How did you come for this to be your focus?
It literally was an accident that brought me here, and it was a dark time in my life. My background is in banking, is in wealth management, and I had a very successful career. I came from a very disturbed childhood, a lot of domestic violence, sexual abuse, lots of what I call adverse childhood experiences. But I managed to get a law degree, and I managed to navigate myself out of, let's say, that line of poverty that I was in and trauma. And I got myself into banking. And I lost my banking career in 2012 due to a racial incident where I felt I was discriminated against. I took it to tribunal, and that's where I lost my case. And that's where I found out court's a playground of proof, not truth. And from those highs of being in high banking, I found myself becoming homeless. And it was during this episode, my mother passed away. And it was at this point where I thought, actually, I can't really see myself living beyond mum passing away. I wasn't seeing my three amazing children. So I attempted suicide. And how I did that is by way of driving my car towards a tree. But as I was heading towards the tree, somebody came out of a giveaway. And I was then involved in a road traffic accident rather than hitting the tree. I was arrested for drink driving, and then I was rearrested for death by dangerous driving. And at that moment, my life blacked out. I completely collapsed into my body. And from there, I call that the death of the first version of me. The first version of me was very money orientated and ego led. And I was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment, reduced to 6 because of my guilty plea. And I'm coming to the very end of that. I've got 24 days left of that prison sentence to serve. But it was during this darkness and this isolation period where I actually connected to my purpose and connected to who I am. And I started to have a much better conversation and narrative with myself. And it was me becoming a little bit of light for myself. But as I became more light for myself, I started to become light for others. So I started to find out that by being of contribution and service, I actually could find my purpose and my why in life.
Wow. There's so much, again, that you've just shared. And I can't help but think of that one phrase that you used there of the courts being a playground of proof, not truth, and how that moment of not feeling heard and going to that tribunal where you didn't win then led to everything else, that series of events that then happened thereafter. Do you believe that had they not happened, you would have got to where you are now?
I don't think I would have achieved the summit that I'm on now. I couldn't find a way out when I was in banking. That high ego world, that drug taking, that party lifestyle. It was all what we say by me, not through me. And I don't think I would have done the inner work, that deep excavation work that I have done, because I wasn't in isolation. And I do believe that when people spend significant periods of their life in isolation, they do that deeper dive on who they are and why they fit in. But I equally had a huge cataclysmic karmic debt created by my actions, which I had to come to terms with. I had to accept that I was the one that authored that accident, and I was the one that every step I took me towards that. So I generally feel that although I wasn't led there, the universe had a plan for me that was much bigger than my mind could contemplate at the time. But equally, it's given me a sort of runway, a pathway ahead for me to follow.
And you said it was a death of the first version of you. Unfortunately, it was also the death of another person. How does that sit with you?
It's one of those episodes which is really hard to articulate in life. And a lot of people, I've done a lot of work on lots of sort of trauma impact stuff. And a lot of people have said to me is, well, once you can start talking positively about this episode, you would have healed. And I use the analogy that sometimes we have scars that will never heal. They will always be an open wound. But you have to accept that I have an open wound. And the work that I do now is driven primarily by the remorse that I have for that accident, by my victim and for his family and towards his community. But equally, it's something that I had to accept that actually I couldn't punish myself forever going forward. Otherwise, two people would have died at that accident, both metaphorically, but equally in reality. And I now live for both my victim and his family. So I have sort of almost a double joy episode where I try and find joy in everything, even when it's not so joyful, because people do say to me, "You're always so happy." And I went, well, I have two reasons to be happy. One is my own and one is my victim's.
Are you in contact with them at all, Gaz?
Unfortunately not. I did reach out to them at the time of the court case and the proceedings. I wrote a letter to both them and to the judge, sort of highlighting my remorse. And my remorse will live with me for the next 10 dominions of my life. It won't be something that will be washed away easily. But they weren't ready to accept my letter, and I've let it be since then.
The social justice and the bringing down barriers of what talent looks like is your focus now. And the rubies in the rubble is what you're searching for, or what you're extracting, what you're bringing out and bringing to the sort of forefront, these global voices. What do you want to achieve through this work?
I believe that everybody is born with talent, and we believe that talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. That talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. And having spent 1,093 days with this talent, or 3 years, talking to this talent, living with this talent, breaking bread with this talent, I realized that actually there's so much more that society should be doing. And I use an analogy that many people that leave prison rehabilitate, but society doesn't. That we almost have a medieval view on crime and punishment, that once somebody's made a mistake, they are defined by that mistake. And they're not allowed to start their resurrection story. And having seen that, and seeing literally the raw talent that's available, and when I used to talk to them, I used to tell lots of the lads I was with, I said, I would employ you on the outside because you're a great salesman. But what he went into prison for was he was selling firearms before he went into prison. So I saw all of these transferable skills these humans had. And I thought, well, if I legitimize and legalize what you're selling, you've got all of the attributes to be a great salesperson. And I did that while I was in prison, but I equally did that when I got to open prison, where I got free men out into work, and we worked in the City of London selling IT courses. And it proved to me that the ideology that I had, the ideation that I was setting in my prison cell, could be something that I could build on when I come out.
And so you are.
We're certainly doing our bit.
Yeah. So what's the vision?
Well, I'm the founder of Empowerability. I'm also workforce development director at a company called Nexus, founded by Paul Kerslake, and that's based both in the UK and in the USA. We've got more than 650 people into work from incarceration, 250 in the UK and 400 in the US, and that's growing. And the US element is growing fast. Despite America having mass incarceration, they do second chance hiring, or fair chance hiring, as I call it, much better, and they have many more pathways. I'm trying to be a living advocate of that talent. So I've used my custodial sentence, which, as I've mentioned, is coming to a close in 24 days' time, is to show what's possible. And I use the analogy of the Olympic torch. Is someone gave me an Olympic torch 6 years ago, but it was in a prison cell, and it said, see how far you can run with this, while I was stuck in a cell with a door that I couldn't open and had no control when that door opened. I've managed in the last 8 months to travel 4 times overseas. I started off my work travels working overseas, talking about the talent in Amsterdam last October, in front of Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney, talking about the talent they could recruit from prison, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. We've seen the success of Top Boy and Adolescence recently. I then worked at the Elite Mentorship Forum's last ever Millionaires Business School with Peter Sage. And then more recently, I've just come back from Athens, where I worked with Radio Days Europe, talking about the talent that could be in the radio world, and come back from a life-changing event in South Africa as part of Incarceration Nations Network's Global Freedom Fellowship, where I spent 2 glorious weeks in South Africa.
And you say 2 glorious weeks. We're not talking about sitting by the beach or going up the mountains, or I'm sure you had some of those moments, but what for you constitutes glorious?
It was, I did manifest in my cell that I would be doing the work that I'm doing. I didn't manifest some of the partners I'm working with. So there's a company called Jadco that's recently started with Nexus. So there's lots of elements that I couldn't foresee. With South Africa, that was a trip that completely was a gift from the universe. I could not say to you that I sat in my cell and I said to myself, I'm going to make it to Robben Island, and I'm going to stand in Nelson Mandela's prison cell, and in this hand I'm going to hold his prison key, and in this hand I'm going to hold his Nobel Peace Prize medal at some point, while I was looking at a door I couldn't open. That is beyond both my own imagination, but I think the imagination of any Hollywood scriptwriter out there. It was a pure gift, but I think it was a reward for the work I'd done, or the seeds I'd set while I was in prison, because I found, as I said, my purpose and calling in prison. And that was linked to the fact that I was helping people. I could use my privilege and some of the skills that I'd acquired in life to help other people become a little bit of light in their life, so that they could find light in their darkness. But for me, the glorious part of the trip for South Africa was being with 14 amazing humans from around the world, from as far as Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, the US, the Virgin Islands, Jamaica, and then 3 of us from the UK, who all descended onto Cape Town and Johannesburg to talk about social justice and social injustice across the world, and what could we do as a collective, as a cohort of humans who all had the same passion and desire, and that is to make sure that all of our children can rise with dignity and without the fear of bias.
Wow, I love that. And you mentioned earlier that you're so focused when you're in prison on rehabilitation, and yet society is not doing the work. What is it that we can do from the perspective of integrating you back into society?
I think the first question is, I always tell people, is do the inner work. Is if you think you don't carry any bias as a human being, then you're not being a human and a being at the same time. There's a fracture. We all carry a degree of bias. We all have assimilations, things we like. You know, I did a self-analysis on myself when I said, Why don't I have fully able disabled people as friends? And that was because I'd realized that I had a bias towards people that were fully able. I had people that had hidden disabilities, or let's say were neurodivergent or neurodivergent, but it wasn't a fully abled disabled person. And that's because of my own biases, is because I had inbred a journey in life where I wasn't around those people, but I never made any energy towards that. So I'm correcting that by doing some of the work that I'm doing in that field. So we all carry biases as humans. What we mustn't do as humans is hold somebody to the worst day of their life and saying that's who they are. And I use the analogy that my worst day in my life was at the beginning of January 2018 when I had my accident. Nobody that's listening to this or watching this is the same person they were in January 2018. We've all evolved and hopefully become better people, but we are certainly different people. A lot of us in prisons, we do the deep dive, we put the hand on the chin, we take on that Socrates pose and become a bit more philosophical about what we do in life. And we do that inner work, but also the outer work. We want to come back. We know what it looks like to be in prison and isolated from family and friends and society. A prison sentence should come with a full stop. So if you're sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, it should be 10 years imprisonment. But after you leave and go through that gate, there should be a full stop. But what tends to happen is you come out with a comma, you come out with no full stop, and what was a 10-year sentence becomes a life sentence. And I'll give you some examples. My home insurance has gone up because I've got a criminal record. I've never set fire to a candle in my house, but my home insurance has gone up as a result. So there are lots of these, and I think in America there are 44,000 legal roadblocks once you've been incarcerated. And what we need to do is look at those, and the biggest signal for lowering the rate of reoffending is to ensure people have purposeful employment, that they have a sense of purpose, they have a sense of why do they want to flip their duvet in the morning. And work and employment is a real empowerment towards that. Now, when we think, oh, well, I don't want someone like that working with me, you probably are already working with somebody that has a criminal conviction, because 1 in 4 people in the UK carry a criminal conviction. And so they're on the tubes, they're at the sandwich shops, they're in the coffee queues where you are. So you're already amongst them. It's just that the media generally highlight all of the failures. They very rarely promote the success stories from prison. I know many people that have left prison and gone on to do amazing work. People that run their own green energy consultancy business in the Cotswolds, nobody knows about him. People that go on to become inspirational, resilient leaders in their chosen field, nobody knows about them. The stories of women in prison, when we think about, when I first stepped into a woman's prison, I realized my privilege as a male prisoner compared to a female prisoner, because I knew every day of my sentence when my children were sleeping. Whereas when a woman's gone into prison, if she's the principal care person, she may lose access to where her children are. And so society needs to do a deep dive on what they see. And they also need to ask the question, what do they think the purpose of prison is? Is it to keep us locked away for a certain segment and then not to allow us back in? Then where are we meant to go? Then what we're doing is we're promoting that hamster wheel of reoffending by saying, we're not going to let you in, so good luck on the outside, in a world that's very monetized, and we're still living in that cost of living crisis. It shouldn't be a crisis of us living.
And it's so interesting that the work that you've done was based on the fact that you knew you were guilty. And I've had a previous guest, Dr. Louise Hewitt, who talks about her work with Innocence, Project Innocence London, which is all around, or Innocence Project rather, and that's all around the fact that some people go into prison and they are innocent, but they have to go through the work as though they were guilty before they are rehabilitated. So they're caught in this catch-22, and it's a very fine line, this justice line. And as you shared earlier, right at the beginning of the conversation, that fine line was not in your favour in terms of you weren't believed in the tribunal. And so what can happen is you can do all of this work and yet the prison system relies on you having been guilty. to start with. Now that worked for you because you said you were, and that was the case. But some people are in there and not. The reason I mention this is that the whole system, the whole justice system, is need of review, and a societal perspective as well.
We tend to dehumanize anybody that's gone through the prison system, and I hear you on those that are on remand, where they haven't been because of COVID. We're about two and a half years behind on court listings. So if you're let's say alleged to have committed an offence, you won't go to court for 2.5, 3 years from now. And if you're a risk to society, you'll be placed on remand. That's not fair on the person that's been placed on remand, but equally, it's not fair on the victim or the alleged victim of the crime to having to wait so long. But when you're in remand and local prisons, when I go into them, I ask one of the questions I always ask at outset is, what's your remand rate? And it used to be around the 30-40%. Now it's double that. So imagine being in a building where 80% of the population think they're innocent, but they're being locked away. The energy for the staff, for the other residents, for everybody involved is pretty drastic. We have got some beautiful beacons of what good justice looks like. We look to the Nordic countries, and Norway leads the way. I think Norway had a terrible record not so long ago, in literally the early 90s, and they did the inner work and did the revolutionary work, where they actually just said, we're going to treat anybody that comes to prison as a human, and we're going to get rid of life sentences. And if we have life sentences, they're going to be pretty shallow. And what we've had in the UK is sentence inflation. So if we go back to Tony Blair's sort of time as Prime Minister, when he says he's going to be tough on crime and the causes of crime, we had a drop in people in prison, but that was purely down to the fact that we had a drop in a population that would normally go to prison, and that's normally the 15 to 18-year-olds that sort of underpin the prison population. We had a drop in the number of those on the streets. But what they did do is they started to inflate the sentences. So there's been around about a 30% increase in sentence inflation. And now with the early release scheme, which the government have introduced with Keir Starmer, what you are finding is that judges are now inflating their sentences, knowing that a person's only going to serve 40%. So what may happen in the future, if we don't have a prison population crisis with the 4 new prisons being built, you may find that people have got an extended sentence for no reason, just purely because of the fact the judge thought they might get out at 40% and not 50%. As I said, good justice looks to me like a lot more community involvement. There is a huge influx of young people. I mean, I'm talking of children as young as 11, 12, being criminalized or being introduced to the police from school. So in the old days, and I remember having a few scuffles at school, you got dragged to the headmaster told you off, you shook hands and you went home, and if you lived in the same street, the community got involved. It was a community resolution. Whereas now, that same episode today, the police would be called at outset. So the two of us would be put into handcuffs and be ending up in a prison cell. And that's where you start to get that mistrust with the justice system. But equally, we have a lot of women in prison that shouldn't be there. So if we look at some of the economic reasons why women are in prison, a lot of women are in prison for, oddly enough, for not paying a TV license. But if you think about it, they're normally the first people to open the door to anyone that's a bailiff or someone that wants to drop an order or warrant on somebody. They're usually the person that receives it. There are also a lot of women are in prison because of a man, either through coercive behavior or domestic violence, or a man's left something in your shoebox without telling you, and it happens to be a firearm or some drugs or some money. So we need to really review the women in prison, because they make up a small proportion of the estate, around about 5%. They don't get the attention they deserve. But when we look at the ripple effect or the ricochet effect of when a woman's in prison, the children could be in the care system. And we know in the UK that 1% of the UK population is care experienced, but they make up 30% of the prison population. So we're almost grooming through policy our next generation of prison population.
Yeah, there are so many side effects to one issue, every time you mention something, there are a ripple or a ricochet, as you say, that a house of cards, that everything else falls over. Going back to the having the two things in your hand, you mentioned in one hand the key to Nelson Mandela's prison cell, and in the other hand, the Nobel Peace Prize, both of which were beyond your imagination in terms of when you were thinking about what life would be like when you were in your own cell. What can you now do with the privilege of that experience?
Well, I mean, I'm going back in on Wednesday to Pentonville for the first time. So it's the first time I'm returning there. And that was the first prison I went into. Is to use that storytelling skill that I have, that orator's sort of mouthpiece, to get people to realize that we all have that resurrection story within us, that when our hands are handcuffed, that we could be holding a prison key in one hand, but equally a Nobel Peace Prize medal in the other. And all of us, I think any human being has the ability to have that human resurrection in whatever circumstance. It could be being a single mom, it could be coming out of a divorce, it could be anything like that. We have resurrection stories. We don't seem to glorify them in the same way we glorify a negative story. So for me, is to use the power and privilege that I've been granted by being on that trip with the Global Incarceration, or with the Incarceration Nations Network through the Global Freedom Fellowship, to use that in my work with Nexus as the Workforce Development Director. So I can tell corporates this is what can be achieved. If you had a chance to get Nelson Mandela on your board, most people would say yes. He's a pretty good negotiator. And is to get people to reimagine what the art of possible is. So for me, it's about storytelling. It's about giving people that living belief. And as I said, in 24 days, my Olympic torch runs out of gas. I will lay it on the ground, and I will encourage anyone behind me or ahead of me to see if they can run past me with their own Olympic torch and their own stories of success from prison.
And the Olympic torch is a key one, isn't it? Because it's a baton that gets passed from one nation who is hosting the games to the following one, for the next 4 years in preparation for. So this preparation that you've been holding this torch throughout that journey to then, as you said, just sort of put it down, but actually it's lighting the fire. It's lighting the fire for the next person, and for what is, well, it's lighting the fire for that event, that's the end of, right, or the start of the games, but the end of that preparation. So for you, it is the end of the preparation and it's the start of the actual event.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's quite interesting you use the Olympic analogy, because I was in Athens not so long ago looking at the original Olympic Stadium. I stood outside Socrates' prison. Now, Socrates' prison is something that's dear to my heart because I learned about philosophy when I was in Pentonville. And again, if you said to me 6 years ago, oh, Jazz, one day you'll be standing outside the same prison and the philosophical stories you were sharing in prison, I would have laughed. But that's what's possible when you plant seeds well before you're hungry. Success does leave clues, and I'm not saying that my blueprint is the way forward for anybody, but it does show that with application, resilience, and planning, but also being very contrarian. Yeah, I was very happy to be known as the thief in prison. I was known as the thief of joy, and people said, "What does that mean?" They said he used to always take the joy out of the transaction. So he goes, "Oh, you can keep the joy. You can't really buy anything with the joy." They said, "But what does he look like?" They goes, "Oh, you can't miss him." They said, "Why is that?" And he goes, "He's the happiest man in prison." And I really found a sense of joy in prison, a sense of purpose. And I'm not, and I'm still not unhappy to share that. People think it's controversial when I say prison was a period of joy for me, but that's because of the level of transformation that I went through and who I became. And because I'm human, anybody has that potential to do the same. But it's to actually be honest with themselves and get rid of a lot of the trauma that we carry in life, a lot of the stuff that's happened to us, and re-navigate how we look at that.
Yeah, I mean, you opened up by sharing the trauma you'd experienced right in your early life, and yet that hasn't been part of this conversation because it's not something that you need to bring into the conversation. Socrates was imprisoned, as far as I can remember, for not believing in the gods that society was telling him
Yes, yeah,
you need
yeah,
to believe in, and for corrupting the youth in sharing his version of what was important.
exactly.
How do you differ? Or you don't, do you?
No, 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 no. I'm not going to put myself in Socrates' shoes. I just believe that as humans, I always start the question with, what would love do?
Mm.
What would love do? So if we want a loving society, we want a society that's integrated, we want a society that shows that people can make mistakes, um, that you can move beyond that mistake, that you're not defined by that mistake, then surely there's a better way of doing it at the moment, because we know the reoffending rates are too high at 2/3. We know that society has a bleak view of what somebody leaving prison does. And if I may, I'll quote Nelson Mandela. Um, he said this after release: "I've walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter. I have made missteps along the way, but I've discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one only finds there are many more hills to climb. I have taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come. But I can only rest for a moment, for with freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not ended."
Freedom and responsibility come hand in hand. Viktor Frankl mentions it in his book. It is, you can't have one without the other. And again, Nelson Mandela articulates exactly that. It seems that as though you recognize that as a concept.
You've mentioned two people. This is my version of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. I had the honor and privilege, my flatmate, so I live with a barrister, so it's like the barrister and the crook are in the flat, she gave me a book called Nelson Mandela's Prisons Letters before I left. And I said to her, I said, look, with respect, I'm going to read it when I'm in South Africa. And during the trip, I started to read the book and got into it. And there's a letter that Nelson Mandela wrote on the 4th of February 1969 to his two daughters, in particular to Zenzi. And when I was in Johannesburg as part of the fellowship, we went to the Nelson Mandela Foundation and we got into his personal archives and into his personal papers. And I was asked if I wanted to read a letter that he wrote to his daughter. And it was the same letter that I'd read in the book, in his own hand. And I feel that, and I say this to people beyond justice, beyond the high walls of justice, if you want to stay in the flow of life, just try and be a good human. And the more you're a good human, the more the universe will bless you with stuff. And people think it's a bit airy-fairy and it doesn't work like that. You can't just manifest your way into happiness. And I genuinely disagree. You can set yourself a plan, but what's core to that plan in whatever you do is be a good human with a good heart and don't ask for receipts for everything that you do. And when you do that, the universe opens up in a way that you just cannot imagine. And as I said, if you told me 6 years ago, not only would I be in Robben Island, but I'd be at the foundation. I'd done the Desmond Tutu leadership course on Ubuntu, visited both Desmond Tutu's and Nelson Mandela's. I would have said to you, that's crazy, that you're clearly on drugs and that you need to go and see somebody. But that's my new reality.
I'm with you. I mean, the universe really does work in mysterious ways to help you to navigate this life. And when you show up and you are open to accepting this responsibility, it will then, as you have just said, bring you the freedom that comes with it. And it is a responsibility because when you're aware of what you're able to do, to then choose not to is, I feel, a real shame, which is why I have this podcast, why I bring people onto the show to share what it is that they're doing in their corner of the world to affect the change that they know is possible. You said that everyone has this born talent and that the skills are very transferable and that you are able to see that and to encourage people, to empower them to believe that their skills are transferable such that they can have a second chance. You mentioned that America is better than the US in second chance, and yet they've still got 44,000 roadblocks. I mean, that just is unfathomable that is easier than what is available to us in the UK. It just sounds madness. It really does. Jazz, I can only wish you just all the best in what you're doing in terms of the justice, the social justice, the social injustice, to understand what it is you're doing, but also alongside, I know you're not alone in this work, that you really have embraced it with a collaborative approach. And that is such that you will do things faster and accomplish things sooner. You've shared what it is that society can do and what is possible when that happens. And I love the question, what would love do? It really is an easy one every time for you to find an answer when you frame it such like that. So thank you. Thank you for everything you're doing, and thank you for sharing.
You're welcome, Amy. I look forward to seeing your future success as well. Keep doing the amazing podcast. And yeah, look forward to hearing any comments or feedback. People can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty much on LinkedIn only. Jazz Singh, founder of Empowerability and Workforce Development Director at Nexus.
Amazing. Jazz, thank you so much. Please share with us some final words.
Well, for me is the journey of going into prison was something that was almost a gift to me. And my story is similar to many other stories, is that when we are in darkness, we can become our light. But when you become light for yourself, as I said, you become light for others. If you read most of the holy books out there, from the Gita, the Quran, the Torah, the Granth, the Bible, there's always stories of isolation, periods of isolation. There's lots of people that are in and out of prison. There's a lot of stories of criminality. And what we must do when we're reading these books and also living our lives is to understand that as a human, we can make a mistake. But as long as we rectify from that mistake and we are true and honest in that, we should give people what I call not even a second chance, because some people need 3 or 4 chances, but to give everybody an equitable chance, or a chance with equity, where you want them to succeed. There's no point bringing somebody into your employment if you're looking at them going, well, they might steal my lunch. Let me go and check on my lunch every 10 minutes. That's not on air. It's about creating a sense of belonging. And I use the words of Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela to close. In the spirit of Ubuntu, I am because you are because I am. I am safe because you're safe because I'm safe.
This episode's over, but let's keep the conversation going. How has this episode impacted you? Share your insights, takeaways, and reflections with actions on social media, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Your feedback creates powerful ripple effects, helping others to discover its value. Want to dive deeper into purpose? Check the show notes for links on how to work with me, where to buy my new book, Focus on Why, Create a Purposeful Way of Life, available in paperback, ebook and audiobook, and where to sign up for Friday Focus, my weekly newsletter. Have a purpose, have a plan, focus on why.